This might change your life. Hey, I am Chuck the Bureaucrat, and occasionally people will ask me whether or not they can retire from the regular army and then go serve in the reserve components. And normally the answer is not a chance. But regular Army warrant officers can do this. They can transition to the Army Reserve or the Army National Guard, and they can draw their retired pay while drilling. So today, I thought I'd show you why that's true and how it gets done, and then talk a little bit about how you would determine if this was a good idea for your personal circumstances. To get started, let's take a look at Army Directive 2021-28, which creates this policy. Actually, let me first make this technical point. This is an Army directive, and Army directives are a class of Army publication that serve as a temporary directive from the Secretary of the Army that establishes or changes policy Army-wide. Only the Secretary of the Army can issue an Army directive, and these documents take precedence over existing Army policy. But here's the tricky thing. Army directives are supposed to be incorporated into the regulations they change within 2 years. Now, there's plenty of cases where it takes longer than 2 years to get this done, and that is the situation here. This one came out in the summer of 2021. Normally, I don't worry about this, but if you're excited about this option, you might want to check the Army Publishing website to confirm that the directive is either still in place or that it's been incorporated into AR 135-100. The purpose of this policy is to allow retired regular Army warrant officers to be appointed as reserve component warrants with retention on the U.S. Army retired list. This directive applies only to regular Army warrant officers. It does not apply to retired reserve component warrant officers. Oh, somebody just got dollar signs in their eyes, did they? Well, this policy has a number of fiddly little points about date of rank and mandatory retirement and so on, but for you, I'll focus on the compensation. First, a retired regular Army warrant officer can draw retired pay and reserve component drill pay, but they can't do it at the same time. Essentially, someone opting into this arrangement has to waive 1 day of retired pay for each calendar day that they perform reserve duty. Second, when the warrant officer's service in the reserve component ends, they can recalculate their retirement to take advantage of the additional days of service. On the face of it, this seems like the best of both worlds. A warrant officer can start drawing retired pay, keep earning drill pay. They can increase their length of service, maybe get promoted and increase their base pay. And at the end of the day, they walk away with a bigger pension. But to get an idea of how this might work out, let's consider a hypothetical CW3 with 20 years of service. And let's assume that he would get promoted to CW4 at 25 years of service, regardless of whether he stayed active or shifted to the reserve components. And let's look at 3 scenarios. One where he just retires at 20 years. One where he stays active until he has 30 years of service. And then one where he transitions to the reserve components at 20 years and he stays with the reserve components until he has 30 years of service. Now, I'm making a couple of simplifying assumptions just to keep the analysis clean, like I'm ignoring BAS and BAH. You get those while you're on active duty, but you don't get them while you're in a reserve status. And the real reason I'm ignoring this is because since basic allowance for housing is based on your location and I don't know where you would be living, well, then it's easier to ignore it. And then if I'm going to do that, I might as well ignore basic allowance for subsistence too. Besides, when we get to the main takeaway, these additional allowances don't seem to really influence the so what. The other thing I'm doing is just using 2025 basic pay rates. I know. inflation and pay raises and time value of money. But honestly, just shoveling more and more assumptions into this analysis does more to cloud it than to help us decide if this would be a good option for you. So if you want to make refinements to this analysis based on your personal situation, you can go ahead. In fact, you can email me and I'll help give you some ideas about what you might want to consider. Okay, under the first scenario, our warrant officer is going to retire at 20 years. His retired pay multiplier will be 2.5% times 20, or 50%. And let's just use his annual final base pay to determine his retired pay. So he gets about $49,000 a year in retired pay. Under the next scenario, he's going to stay active for 30 years and make CW4 along the way. This increases his retired pay multiplier to 75%. And since his base pay also increases due to promotion and longer service, his annual retired pay in gold is a little over $9,500. And of course, he also gets all that base pay in dark green for those last 10 years, which sums up to about $1 million by itself. So what happens if our warrant officer takes this AC to RC deal? Well, let's assume that he does the absolute minimum amount of reserve duty. You know, the old 1 week in a month and 2 weeks a year. And I know that probably is not entirely realistic, but we'll come back to this point in a second. Oh, and I'm not going to explain the relatively arcane way that the reserve components handles drill pay. I mean, that would be a video unto itself. I'm just going to assume that our buddy gets 62 paid drill periods a year. That's 48 plus 14. Plus, he gets 15 membership points every year that are unpaid, but they count towards his length of service. So his retired pay, while he is in the reserve components, is going to get reduced to $43,800 a year because he has to waive retired pay on the calendar days he drills. That's in blue. His drill pay, in light green, starts at $16,800 a year, and it rises to $20.8K as he rises in rank over time. And then, when he recalculates his retirement, he will have earned a little over 2 more years of service to boost his retired pay multiplier. But the real benefit comes from the increased base pay that gets used in this calculation. So, once he's finally done with military service, he has his retired pay recalculated at $66,800 a year. All right, so that is a lot of math to get to the key takeaway, which probably should have been pretty obvious from the beginning. Retiring from active duty with 20 years of service, it sets a lower limit on your DoD compensation. And sticking around 30 years, it sets an upper limit. No matter how much time or what you do in the reserve components, you will always be somewhere between those 2 points. And I know somebody out there is thinking, well, I'll just move over to the reserve components and then pick up some active duty orders. And sure, but that seems like staying on active duty with more steps. To me, there's really 3 reasons that might make this a smart decision. Number 1, if you think that your chances of getting promoted in the reserve components are higher than they are on active duty, well, then that might make this an attractive option. Number 2, if you think that you can get a good job, maybe a federal government job, well, then maybe what you could be doing is earning a second pension while still increasing your military retired pay. That might be a good idea. Although I should warn you that since you qualify for retired pay, you won't be able to buy back any of your military service towards that federal pension. Or, number 3, if you have personal affairs that take up a portion of your time, but still leave an opportunity for serving with the reserve components, well, that might be a pleasant way to occupy yourself. But at the end of the day, this decision is not truly a financial decision. It's a lifestyle choice. It's a decision about what you want your life to look like after you reach the point that you can voluntarily retire from active duty. And if you want to think more broadly about that decision, watch one of these videos.